Have you ever experienced a God thing? Hallmark calls them God winks. I call them God things. And I must be honest that every once in a while it happens. And you say, all the events that have taken place has actually caused this. It's got to be a God thing that's there. An opportunity that you realize only God could have put before you. You know it because all these circumstances had to be engineered in order for this to take place. It works like this. God plants a desire or a thought into your mind that's going on, stirs your heart, gives you a sense of restlessness to make you want to change your life. Maybe perhaps get more out of your life than what you're getting. It's kind of like a fortune cookie that's broken in your mind and it says, watch out, God is going to do something really interesting, unbelievable in your life. Maybe it's a phone call that you received or a letter that you've gotten or an email or something that you've watched television-wise. My first God thing was when I least expected it. You know, it happened that I went to a youth group. And youth groups were important to me. It was a way to escape the house that was not necessarily a happy place to be. And the minister came to talk to us youth that night, and ultimately what he said, if you want to be happy in life, ask God what he wants to do with your life. And so, not being happy and wanting to find true happiness, I prayed my evening prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And by the way, God, I sure like to be happy, so let me know what you want me to do and I'll do it. Well, little did I realize that I was asking for God to do a God thing in my life. Later on that night, somewhere in the early morning or later on that night, I had a white light and a voice that says, I want you to be a minister. I was really excited about this. So the first thing in the morning came, I went to ultimately ask my mother, say, Mom, guess what happened last night? She says, I know, I had a dream last night. You're going to become a minister. Wow. Mind you, I said things were not good at home. The divorce was about to happen. The big D, any moment. And because of that, my grades at school suffered. And ultimately, because my grades were poor, the church said, you're not going to be ordained. You must be mistaken. You can't go to college with grades like that. And needless to say, I was hurt by the church. And I started to run from God. I got, God, take your call to be a minister and just kind of, in fact, take your relationship with me and stuff it. I don't want any part of it at all whatsoever. And that for me meant that I joined the Army, dropped out of college, joined the Army, and ultimately 20 years later, before I finally fully responded to that God thing that he placed on my life, basic training, advanced individual training, and then straight to Vietnam. 35 months in Vietnam, and I was a rambling wreck. I had post-traumatic stress, but I didn't know that I had post-traumatic stress. We didn't have a title for it then. You know, but God was sending people my way all the time to help me get to a point and a place where I could respond to that call. The response came, believe it or not, right here in this church when it was back downtown on Avenue Gray. Kay and I, quite honestly, stumbled into the church. We checked out several other churches. Before we left Korea, we asked very simply for us to have a place to serve and a place where my mother-in-law would have a service in her own language, being Korean, and that we could all worship together. But most important, the qualifier was we wanted a place to serve. Well, the Sunday came. It was the very first Sunday at First United Methodist Church in Killeen. It was Communion Sunday, and church then was a lot higher in the way they did communion. The liturgy was more involved, and they sang things back and forth, and it kept flipping pages back and forth, and I was just terribly lost. And there was a sweet, kind of gray, haired, elderly lady that kept feeding me a hymn book and pointing where we were at in the liturgy. Oh, I was so relieved because I was terribly lost. Ultimately, afterwards, we had a conversation, and she turned around and said, would you help me with the college and career age Sunday school? I couldn't hardly wait to catch up with my wife. I said, how'd you like the pastor next door in the Korean church, which was meeting in the Clement's chapel at that particular time? She says, I like him. I said, guess what? I had this old lady ask me if I'd help her teach the college and career age Sunday school thing. I think this is our answer to prayer. Thus started a long journey to become an ordained minister that I started at that particular time. God was doing a God thing, but I really didn't know how he was going to work it out. He was putting circumstances and situations together, and I was growing, but the process was going. I was about ready to get out of the Army without even retiring, just become a minister. But that was my idea, not God's idea. I came down on orders for Germany, had a choice to leave my family alone for 22 months or give them the full 20 years and then bring my family to Germany with me. God was orchestrating a God thing. I just wasn't ready for it, nor did I realize how he was working hard to bring it about. Well, I got to Germany, supposed to wait 16 weeks for quarters, and inside of a month I had permanent quarters instead of temps, and my wife was on her way to Germany, and life was good. And then I got recruited for, at the right time and the right place, to work in the command chaplain's office of 4th Transportation Command. A God thing, truly, because I stayed working for that command chaplain's office for 5 whole years. Not something that's the normal norm when you are ultimately in a shortage MOS, military occupational specialty, but I worked there for the entire time that was there until ultimately I retired, went on to a student appointment, and then seminary. I spent most of my time in the Methodist Church in the far west district out in rural Texas someplace, kind of hoping maybe one day I would come back to this church and be this church's pastor, but that was my idea, not necessarily God's idea. Once again, when the time was right and the situations were right, I was assigned to the Harker Heights United Methodist Church, where ultimately my wife and I started a ministry to soldiers, specifically those with post-traumatic stress disorder, to try to hold families together, keep them from breaking up and winding up divorce. And that led to, when I retired from that church and my wife retired from that church, being able to come back home and worship here at First Church. But also it led to a full-time ministry with soldiers on Fort Hood and a combat support group on, actually we still meet today, once the COVID got safe enough where we could kind of get there on Tuesday nights. We used to feed at 6:30 and then break into the 2 separate groups, but now we're just doing groups. We meet at 7 and one family members in one part of the church and me in the other part with the soldiers. We don't have childcare yet because it's just not a possibility to feel safe and whatever, but the group is still going and we're still doing ministry that way that's there. You know, can I just say, you don't go off to war without experiencing post-traumatic stress. Everybody that deploys into that type of situation has it to some extent or the other. And the ultimate purpose is you really don't want it to become a disorder that's there. Church is a wonderful place to keep that from happening. It's a place that ultimately provides a safe place, a healthy place, a loving place that supports a place, allows a soldier time to decompress and reintegrate back with his family, so that it doesn't become a disorder. A place that you feel wanted, a place that you feel loved, a place where you feel the presence of Christ. This church, like any church, in order to reach people for Jesus Christ, needs to be attracting a younger generation. Some children and kids and stuff has always been the focus, but can I say to you very clearly, our soldiers and their families out there are the younger people. It isn't always just all about youth. It's about people that are there. On Veterans Day, let us remember military are some of our young people that we need to be touching their lives and changing their lives with the love of Christ. Unlike many churches, this church has a constant turnover of people. You know, every 3 years you lose a third of your congregation. I've heard people say that's there. And because of that, we've experienced growing pains. Even though the church started in 1862, I believe is the year, 1892, I guess we'll look at my notes a little clearer. Ultimately, it was smaller then, and then the building downtown Killeen, and then this beautiful, magnificent thing. We've had our growing pains, and some we've anticipated, and some we didn't. And honestly, how could you ever anticipate this virus, this pandemic that's going on? And so that begs the question is, the big question, what are we going to do about it? Where do we want to go as a church with all this craziness going on, and the mask and our new normal will be different than it's ever been before? What will set us apart and make us different? How do we envision the church? And the first thing that must happen in order for you to see the vision is that God has given this church is you must see the church beyond the church. What I mean by that is you are the church. In a real sense, you don't go to church, you bring the church in with you. In other words, we've got to move from doing church one day a week to being the church 7 days a week. A church that understands that it takes everyone, everywhere, every day to be the church. I believe that you go back to the New Testament and go way back to when Jesus was walking the face of the earth, you see that it's all about basically three things: a great commandment, a great commitment, and a great commission. The purpose of the church and for the purpose of the follower of Christ can be boiled down to three things: love God, the great commandment; serve others, the great commitment; sharing Jesus, the great commission. I didn't come up with these words just by myself. You just have to take a look at the way that Jesus conducted himself. He said it even better than I could. He lived it, he walked it, he taught it, that was there, he gave it by example. And we ought to be following the example of Jesus Christ. Follow the great commandment, loving God. Now in our scripture lesson that we had this morning, in Matthew 22, there is an interesting story. You got one of those lawyers that was trying to trip up Jesus. And so he comes up with this question as he tried to trap Jesus. He asked him a question that Jesus could have no way answered. He did ask him perhaps the greatest question that Jesus was ever asked: "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Now the law refers to the first 5 books of the Bible in the Old Testament part. In those 5 books, there are 613 commandments. He asked Jesus a question: of the 613, which one's the greatest? How could anybody answer that? And the crowd was breathless out there as they watched it that was there. Everyone in the crowd was stunned when Jesus didn't hesitate, he didn't stutter, he didn't stammer, and he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the great and the foremost commandment." Matthew 22, 37, 38. Think about it. Every commandment that God has ever given us basically summed up to just one. We're to love God with all our heart, our soul, and our mind. And if that's true, then the church, whatever it is, must lead others to love God. The greatest success that a church can experience is to teach others to love God. The biggest failure that a church could ever have would fail to lead people to love God, as God deserves to be loved. The one thing that God really wants from us more than anything else is for us to love him the way that he deserves to be loved. And ultimately, that's one thing he never forces us to do. Any parent knows the one thing we want from our kids basically is to love God, love us, without forcing it on them. Envision a church where the number one thing would be known for in the community is be burning, blazing, passionate love of God. Our church could teach what it means to love God and how to lead people intentionally to grow closer to God and become motivated to love God in every way that they possibly can. I tell you just how important this is. There is not a problem that any church has that couldn't be solved if we ultimately would love God the way that we want to love God. And that gets us to the second part, to fulfill the great commitment, serving others. Jesus made some absolutely incredible statements that along the way, mind-boggling, staggering imagination things that he said. For example, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Love your enemies. Pray for those who try to hurt you. In Matthew 20, he makes a statement that probably makes it one of the top list of things, where Jesus turns around and he says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." Wow. Every time I read that scripture, my mind goes, but wait a minute. You're the Son of God. You're Jesus Christ. You're actually the one that helped create this universe. You want to be served and not serving us, and yet Jesus says he came to serve. Wow. We as a church must lead Christ followers to become Christ's servants. This next statement is crucial. No church will ever rise above its leadership or its servanthood. All leadership in the world is useless if no one is willing to serve. Did you hear that? All leadership in the world is useless if no one is willing to serve. A general is useless if soldiers refuse to fight. A coach on a team, whatever team that you happen to like, is useless if the players don't play. A restaurant, whether it has the best food in the world, is useless if you don't have servants to serve it. You know, they'll go out of business. And what we need in a church and what we must develop in a church is an army of servants. We all are different. We all have our own different gifts and graces, our times, our talents, and that God has given us. And he wants to take who we are, our passions, and our gifts and our skills and abilities and put them to work in the service of the church. Jesus Christ Church, our church. Every single person who is part of a church needs to ask this question. What is the particular service or ministry in the church that I should be all about, that I should be involved in? The place of service is for everyone. It's a job that you're plugged in for. It's a job of the church to put us into those particular slots that are suited for us. The real question I want to ask you is, do you come to church or watch via this online to be served or to serve? And I'm going to be really honest with you. For a long particular period of time in my life, I looked at churches of what they could do for me. I wanted to be a sponge and just soak up all the churches I could and do nothing. Just be kind of a pew warmer. And ultimately, as I think about that, you ever do dishes and you got a sponge and it just soaks up all the stuff and you just leave it there? What happens to it? It stinks. It stinks to high heavens, ultimately. And so what we need to, and God doesn't want any stinky Christians. So what we need to do is soak up all that we can when we come to church, serve and rinse it out by serving, and then be refilled again so that we are a sweet smell to God and to the people that we come into contact with each day. You know, God does not want stinky Christians, but he wants those with a servant's heart that will reach out and touch others. Outside of John 3:16, it's one of the most familiar passages in the scriptures. We have heard it many times. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore and make disciples." That's the Great Commission, sharing Jesus. And you know, we make a lot out of sharing Jesus than we really need to do, because ultimately it's just a matter of telling what God has done for me in my life. You know, the word Christian or disciple is a Christ follower. But Jesus made it very plain. Just go and be a follower of Jesus Christ. Do you know the most important thing that God is important to God is people? You are extremely important to God. God cares about people who do not know him, who do not love him, who do not serve him, and who do not have any relationship with God at all. And he wants to use us to bring those people to a relationship where they love God, they serve God, and they share what God has done in their life. And the easiest and most efficient way of doing that is those that are followers of Jesus Christ to just share with those that we work with, those that we play with, those that are in our community. Luke 8 tells a wonderful story about a man that Jesus healed of a serious disease. And after Jesus healed him, he wanted to travel with Jesus and spend time with Jesus. And Jesus said, look, just go back to your village and tell people what God has done for you. And so the man went back and told and shared of how God had healed him of this very serious illness. Begin right where you live, your neighborhood, your community, your office, your golf course, or whatever. Everyone who's ever become a follower of Jesus has a story to tell. You have a story about how you went from being a non-follower to a follower of Jesus Christ. Our church should teach you and train you and equip you and motivate you of how to share your story. You may be asking, so how is it all going to make a difference? It simply means that we just need to be ready to take the church outside of the walls and share what Jesus Christ has done for you. Here's some things just to keep in mind. First, we all must realize the church is not about programs, it's about a process. And when I first started building up a church, I was evaluated by the bishop on how many different programs I had and how many people I got into each one of those programs and what the attendance was, and the fact that more programs and more programs and more programs. And then we started thinking, boy, if the persons are here on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday, we'll give them Saturday off, and ultimately, they got to be really solid Christians. Can I tell you, some of the meanest people in church that I ever pastored were those that were always here when the church was open? Wow. It's a process of leading people to love God, to serve God, and to share Jesus Christ. It's a process. It's not programs. That leads me to the second application. The effectiveness of the church is measured horizontally, not vertically. Let me tell you what I mean by that. It's very simple. We just have to work the process and become more loving, more serving, and more willing to share it there. There is no way to truly measure the effectiveness of church other than that. Are we moving people to loving God, to serving God, and to sharing their story? And this is important for one reason. There is a world of hurting people out there that need to know about Jesus. Give them Jesus. And the most effective way to get them to be a church may be filled with people who love God and serving others is just to share what God has done for us. So the question is, will you go out and be the church? Amen.